Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4. This week, we're going to focus on image and persona in poetry. So, please get a pen and paper ready for some activities. There's about 3 or 4 of them in this lecture. You should open up the slides on Canvas for this week so that you can follow along and play the videos and click the links that I'm going to use during this. Again, I cannot play the videos because of copyright, so you can watch them on your own if you have it open on a separate tab while you're watching the video. All right, so prompt, get your pens and paper ready. Here is a poem by Margaret Atwood, and it is a metaphor for a relationship. You fit into me. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. All right, that was kind of disturbing, but good. It's a famous poem. All right, so for this activity, I would like you to write in response to the following questions. What has your COVID experience been like so far? Has it been like a holiday, a nightmare, a really boring movie? Compare your feelings around COVID to something, then explain how it's like that thing. So, in more direct terms, come up with a metaphor that uh, stands in for your feelings or your experience during the COVID lockdown. You can give yourself 30 seconds to a few minutes to respond to this activity. Go ahead and press the pause on the video now so that you can participate. I'm going to go ahead and move on with the video. Okay. Metaphor and simile examples. Let's go through a few examples here and analyze them as you would maybe in your reading journals. This is a famous poem, My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Rothke. My Papa's Waltz. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. But I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Okay, so let's analyze this poem. Questions to ask yourself. What do you like about this poem? Was it the cadence, the rhythm, the language, the imagery? What is it doing? What is memorable about it? One thing I felt was very memorable was that the metaphor of the waltz and the father's interactions and relationship with the son. It is traditionally interpreted that the waltz is like a physical abuse, but not everyone reads the poem in that way. For me, comparing it to the waltz, a waltz is a kind of dance, implies that it's something that's done often and it's repetitive because a waltz, they just turn and turn and turn. So the abuse was just something that went on and on and on. Um, what still stays with you after it's over? To me, it was the rhyme and the line, her countenance could not unfrown herself, the mother. I thought that was a very charged, good line. What surprised you most about the poem? To me, I felt that the ending uh, was interesting, given that the father would take him home or take him to bed afterwards. That was part of the dance. And what feelings did you have during the poem? And that's going to be up to you. My feelings are sadness, um, banality. I understand that that's a lot how physical abuse works within families. I also had this idea reading this going, I wonder, are there other kinds of dances that we perform in life that are not literal dances, but metaphorical ones? And what might those be? And so it made me think of the other kind of patterns that I had, not such good ones, in my own family. So, those are various answers and questions you could have while reading this poem in order to analyze it. Here's another one. There Are Birds Here by Jamal May. And I'm going to let you watch this video. This is the poet reading his own poem. It is a striking poem. It is very deep and a bit dark. So when you watch it afterwards, ask yourself these questions. What do you like about this poem? What is it doing? What's memorable about it? What still stays with you after it's over? What surprised you most about the poem? And what feelings did you have during the poem? Okay, now that you're done watching the video and listening to the haunting poem, let's try an activity. Have your pens and paper ready. I would like you to write a poem from one of the following options. Option one, write a poem starting with the concept of experiencing life through the COVID pandemic and connect it to something else. Make a metaphor and describe how the two are similar. Title your poem the metaphor you've chosen, such as blue jay or corn husk or computer, and write about your own experience only as it relates to the metaphor. Don't include any metaphors in the poem. Title your poem the topic living through COVID, or jazz music, or chicken salad, or my mother, and write only about the metaphor. These are options that you could write and or revise and post in your creative writing journals. Next, I'd like to talk about imagery. Imagery is very important in not just poetry, but all creative writing. In fact, in writing in general, it's considered just good writing to write clear, specific images, because what they do is they invoke those images and feelings in the reader. And those images and feelings in the reader then not only tell them what that they should be thinking, but also that they'll have an emotional response and an intellectual response to what you've written. I'm posting here one of my favorite poems by Yosef Kamenyaka. He writes about his experience in the Vietnam War. Note how he uses specific language and imagery and description in order for you to see what he sees and what he in turn is thanking. Thanks for the tree between me and a sniper's bullet. I don't know what made the grass sway seconds before the Viet Cong raised his soundless rifle. Some voice always followed, telling me which foot to put down first. Thanks for deflecting the ricochet against the anarchy of dusk. I was back in San Francisco, wrapped up in a woman's wild colors, causing some dark bird's love call to be shattered by daylight, when my hands reached up and pulled a branch away from my face. Thanks for the vague white flower that pointed to the gleaming metal, reflecting how it is to be broken like mist over the grass as we played some deadly game for blind gods. What made me spot the monarch writhing on a single thread tied to a farmer's gate? Holding the day together like an unfingered guitar string is beyond me. Maybe the hills grew wary and leaned a little in the heat. Again, thanks for the dud hand grenade tossed at my feet outside Chule. I'm still falling through its silence. I don't know why the intrepid sun touched the bayonet, but I know that something stood among those lost trees and moved only when I moved. Okay, so very haunting poem. He utilizes stark, sometimes disturbing, very most times clear, sometimes vague imagery to create the scene, the meaning of the poem. He's in Vietnam. You see a tree, then you see a sniper's bullet, and you realize the relationship between the tree and the sniper's bullet is what is in between him. The tree is what saved him from, dying in Vietnam. The grasses sway, and the Viet Cong, and the soundless rifle. They all kind of add up together for you to create the scene and the sound, and the luck that got him through to survive. So I tried to bold most of the images that would invoke the kind of sensory detail that makes for this poem's success. Okay. So most people understand what imagery is, but unfortunately, the word imagery, although used often, only tends to invoke maybe the sight of detail. So sensory imagery is using all five senses, which is what you want to use in your writing, all writing. Okay, you want to invoke sight, smell, hearing, touch, and taste for your reader. So you're recreating kind of an alternate reality for the reader to jump into when they're reading and to understand what you're trying to convey. Images carry feelings and memories and associations. Sometimes we'll be walking down the street and we'll catch a smell of a certain kind of flower and it'll take us back 30 years. You know, or the memory of mom's cooking. You might walk down the street one day and hear a dog barking and think of a dog you had when you were a kid, right? Or a song in the car, a song that takes you back to another time. um Images and feelings and stuff, all they invoke in us memories, very stark, specific memories that come with very strong emotions. And you want to use that as a writer because that is how the reader engages with your work. It is important, though, to avoid what we'd call a cliche. And a cliche is something that is overused. For example, saying something like, killed two birds with one stone. We don't really break the phrase apart anymore. We don't think of a bird. We don't even see a bird. We don't think stones anymore, unless perhaps, we're breaking it down like we are now. Now you are thinking of that. But because it's something we've said so often, the brain doesn't invoke any more imagery. There's nothing to see. It just carries the meaning straight across. And so that is why we want to, in our writing, to avoid cliche because it doesn't actually help the reader see anything anymore because they have become desensitized to these sayings. Okay, so for this following activity, again, you'll have to have the slides open so you can play the video. And please have a paper and pen ready to help you engage with the activity. This is part two. There are three parts to this poem. It's a very long poem. It's Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which could actually be his most famous poem. This is him actually reading it live, and I timed it so that the video only plays part two, which is called Moloch. Okay. So while you listen to Allen Ginsberg's poem Moloch, which is part two of his long poem Howl, I want you to write down everything you see, hear, and feel. And it's important to listen to Ginsberg reading his poem because, part of the activity is being able to catch those specific details, and that will help tune your ear to them. Right? If you read it, yes, you could scan through a poem to find all the details. But when you're hearing it, it kind of gives you more of a immediate sensation to what's actually happening in the poem. When you're done, look at your list. Just take a step back and go, okay, if I added all of these images together, what might Moloch be a metaphor for? Okay, you can just add them up together. What images made you think, what is this about? What are his opinions here? Or the speaker's opinions. We've talked about, the writer and the author may not be the same. Or the author and the I may not be the same. But what might the speaker be saying here? Okay. Interesting poem, right? That is one of his most famous. Now there was a movie done in response to this poem, and when they did it, they actually animated this section of the poem. And so, what I'd like you to do is here is linked the animated version of Moloch. And I'd like you to compare the imagery you wrote down with the images the artist chose in this animation. Compare them. Are they similar or different? Would you have made similar artistic choices if you were the animator? If you had to animate this poem, how different would it have looked? Would you have chosen similar or different images and why? Okay. After watching the video, did you pick up on the theme or metaphor of religion and capitalism in your own list of images and feelings and thoughts and tastes and sounds that he gave us in his poem? Most metaphors and meanings in a poem are not stated outright. They are carried and implied in imagery and specific detail. You must strike the right balance between understanding and overstating to achieve a successful poem. Too obvious and the reader finds it boring and amateurish. Too obscure and the reader can't decode your meaning. So it's a delicate balance between how far your metaphor goes, how cryptic you are, right? But how obvious you are. You kind of got to, strike a balance. And sometimes you think it works and then you give it to a reader and you find that they didn't understand what your metaphor was, what your images were trying to imply. Whereas sometimes you're so obvious, the reader doesn't really get to participate in the poem enough to make it successful, which is what we use workshop for, which we will be getting into next week. Here at the bottom, I have linked Howl by Ginsberg. If you'd like to read it in its entirety, it is a magnificent, fantastic poem, beat poetry. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about voice. Okay, when you literally hear a voice, you have many subtle oral cues: accent, volume, tone, timbre, pitch, rhythm to help you identify it. As a writer, you have only the words, their choice and arrangement with which to create a unique voice. Yet writers' voices are recognizable too. They too create patterns that approximate all the qualities named above. As a reader, you fall in love with particular poetic or narrative voices, and as a writer, you may try on or imitate those voices. So, here are a few examples of voices that one might consider American, right? Just note how it's fascinating how a writer can, use the pattern of language and vocabulary to invoke different voices as if someone is speaking. Here is Langston Hughes's Boogie 1 a.m. Good evening, Daddy. I know you've heard the boogie woogie rumble of a dream deferred, trilling the treble and twinning the bass into midnight ruffles of catgut lace. Sounds very jazzy. Ode to American English. I was missing English one day, American really, with its pill popping Hungarian goulash of everything from Anglo Saxon to Zulu, because British English is not the same. If the paperback dictionary I bought at Bretano's on the avenue of l'Opera is any indication, too cultured by half. Oh, the English know their delphiniums, but what about doo-wop, donuts, Dick Tracy, Tricky Dick? With their elegant Oxfordian accents, how could they understand my yearning for the hot trot, hot dog, hot flash vocabulary of the US of A? That fragmented fandango of Dagwood's everyday flattening, of Mr. Beasley on the sidewalk, fetuses floating on billboards, drive-by monster hip-hop stereos shaking the windows of my dining room like a 7.5 earthquake. Ebonics, Spanglish, used as comma and period. The inability of 90% of the population to get the present perfect. I have went. I have saw. I have tooken Jesus into my heart. The battle cry of the Bible Belt, but no one uses the King James anymore. Only plain speak versions, in which Jesus, raising Lazarus from the dead, says, "Dude, wake up." And the L man bolts up like a B movie, Mummy. Whoa, I was toasted. Yes, ma'am. I miss the mongrel plentitude of American English. Its fall guy, rat terrier, dog pound neologisms, the balm of it all, the rushing river Jordan backwood mutability of it, the lowrider boombox cruise of it from New Jersey to Hawaii, with its slide dog malasada scarfing beach blanket lingo to the ubiquitous Valley Girls like stuttering shopaholic rant. I miss its Coutodian beauty, its querulous, backbiting, righteous indignation, its preening, rot gut, flat waving cowardice. Suffering succotash sputters Sylvester the cat. Scene D say the pork-bellied legislators of the swamps and plains. I miss all those guys, their Tweety bird resilience, their Doris Day optimism, the candid ungent of utter unhappiness on every channel. The midnight televangelist euphoric stew, the junk male vernacular. On every boulevard and rue, I miss the Tarzan city of Johnny Weissmuller, Johnny Cash, Johnny B. Good, and all the smart talking, gum snapping, hard girl dialogue, finger popping, X rated street talk, sports babble, Cheetos, Cheerios, chili dog diatribes. Yeah, I miss them all. Sitting here on my sidewalk throne, sipping champagne versus lined up like hearses, metaphors juking, nouns zipping in my head like corvettes or dextrine, French verbs slitting my throat, yearning for James Dean to jump my curb. Okay. That was a hard one to read, but I think you get my meaning. I'll leave They Feed, They Lion to you. This is actually one of my favorite poems by Philip Levine. But note how we speak a certain way, right? Depending on where you are from, what languages you may have been speaking in the past or now, who you're talking to. All of those factors kind of mix together to create the voice. Now, I'm not saying necessarily you have to write how you speak. I have a writerly voice that I have developed over the years. If you become a poet or a fiction writer or what have you, you'll learn to adopt certain voices. The voice I use in my writing isn't necessarily the voice that I speak in. Okay. But I tried to make it consistent and to have a kind of character that goes along with it. And so that's something you might want to work on developing throughout this semester. And you will probably end up developing for most of your creative writing career, developing a voice that is uniquely yours, that people can point out and say, that is very much your voice. That is very much you. Okay. So, to make this a little bit more clear, I'm going to introduce this idea of code switching. Okay. So, code switching is the different languages we use in everyday life. And I don't necessarily mean actual languages. You may not be changing from English to German to Spanish. You might be. Right, that could be considered code switching, but a lot of code switching has to do with not necessarily actual languages, but dialects and the words that you choose depending on who you're speaking to. You don't use the same language that you use in front of your mother that you do in front of your friends, coworkers, or boss. We speak in many different modes and use a variety of vocabulary and syntax to get our ideas across. In this way, we already speak in different voices all the time. So, the following article, How Code Switching Explains the World, includes various examples of code switching from regional dialect, body language, and actual languages. Okay. So if you're wondering how somebody can change, which you do all the time, right? How somebody changes their mannerisms, their body language, their tone of voice, the words they choose, just remember who is your audience, right? Imagine if your mother was your audience. What words would you choose to write? Whereas if you were writing a poem to your friends, what words would you choose? If you were creating a character that lives in a certain area at a certain time and place, how might they speak to other people in that time and place? Um, to illustrate, you can see Barack Obama, just his body language as he shakes different hands from different people. There's this person that he first shakes hands with is a white person, right? Then he goes to a black person, and he changes his body language and the way he even shakes hands, right? So think about your own experience with this and utilize it in your own work. Okay. So the concept of a persona allows us to acknowledge that just as no written account can tell the whole truth about an event, so no I of a poem, essay, or story is exactly the same as the person who writes it. The version of yourself that you choose to reveal is part of your meaning. Okay. So again, you will maybe Think of the I in a poem not as the author, but as a persona or the mask of the poet. Because when I write my poems and my stories, I don't necessarily use the I that I feel is me. Okay. Because that would be kind of impossible, right? You can't put your whole self there. I use a voice that represents the character of me, or sometimes someone completely different that's not me. So for these two poems, you might be able to identify the voice, the tone, the emotion of the author, especially in Daddy by Sylvia Plath. In My Last Duchess, Rudyard Kipling writes from the persona of a duke, okay, that may or may not have murdered his wife. So obviously, Rudyard Kipling did not do it, but his character in the poem did. So I will leave you to read those poems on your own. Here is also an example of persona of somebody, a poet taking on the voice and the experiences that they themselves has not actually had. Here is the first stanza, and you can listen to the rest. You can actually listen to Anne Sexton reading her poem in 1966. And here is just the first stanza. Her kind. I have gone out, a possessed witch, haunting in the black air, braver at night, dreaming evil. I have done my hitch over the plain houses, light by light. Lonely thing, 12-fingered, out of mind. A woman like that is not a woman, quite. I have been her kind. Okay. So go ahead and watch the video, and you can hear her reading her poem, kind of invoking this idea of the witch. Whoops. Okay, here we go. Okay. So we're going to work on writing a profile or persona poem. Um, To do that, you would begin by writing down the names of several people you know well and often come across in your home, school, or neighborhood. You'd pick one of those people and write a paragraph describing their physical attributes, how they look, sound, smell, move in great detail. And in that way, you would be able to write about someone else from the voice of somebody else, or you can write in their voice, right from their point of view. Now, here's an example of a poem where someone did just that. So, in Abuelita by Paul Martinez Pompa, he writes about his mother um, cooking. And I'd like you to click on that link, and it's actually a video of a reading of the poem. And here are the questions that you should be asking yourself. What do you like about the poem? What is it doing? What's memorable about it? What still stays with you after it is over? What surprised you most about the poem? And what feelings did you have during the poem, or even the residual ones afterwards? Here is another example of a poem that you should answer these questions to help you decode character profile and persona in poetry. As an example, this one is not a video. But it is rather long, so I'm not going to read it here. Okay, but I ask that you read it on your own time. Okay, so now your turn. Here are some prompts if you would like to write a persona poem. Write a poem from one of the following options. How might portraits or masks be dangerous? How might portraits or masks be a tool for survival? Write a two-part poem. Part one, what others see or assume about this person's identity. Part two, what do you see? Okay, so let's move on to something similar but different, personification and anthropomorphism. Okay, so anthropomorphism is when you apply human qualities to perhaps a pet you have had, or an object would be personification, an object you own or are familiar with. Okay, so as the examples show, it's when we give human quality to animals or things that are not human. All right. Um, you might want to ask yourself, how do they move like a person? How do they look like a person or sound like a person? Think large and small. You could write about body parts, personalities, statements. What could be turned into a kind of person with a personality and all of the traits and features of a human, but who themselves or what themselves are not human. So, free write for 30 seconds. Try writing in the voice of your pet or favorite animal. What might be they be thinking? Okay, what might they be saying to you? What is their personality? So, in this example, in my mother's house, it's also a very good example of imagery and using specific imagery to invoke feelings. I'd like you to analyze this poem by Gloria Murray, and I'll go ahead and read this one to you. In my mother's house, every wall stood at attention. Even the air knew when to hold its breath. The polished floors looked up, defying heel marks the plastic slipcovers crinkled in discomfort. In my mother's house, the window shades flapped against the glare of the world. The laughter crawled like roaches back into their cracks. Even the humans sat, cardboard cutouts around the Formica kitchen table, and with silver knives sliced and swallowed their words. So that is an example of personification, giving human qualities to a house. Here is another example of poetry using anthropomorphism. Okay, and Mary Oliver, she died recently, but she was a wonderful poet, very famous. And so I'm going to let you just go ahead and press play down below in the slides and watch her reading this very sweet yet short poem. If you like animal poems or poems about animals, she has a whole series of poems about her dogs. She loved her dogs very much. Okay, so if you choose to write a personification poem or an anthropomorphism poem, here are a couple prompts to get you started. What do you think your pet would say if it could talk? What secret might it reveal about you if it could? Make an emotionally charged object you know very well, like a house, a piece of jewelry, a sewing machine, a sports hat, or a war medal. Make it come alive. Okay. So that is our lecture for this week. All of your readings are posted, and so obviously are the lecture slides, which I hope you'd had open so you could watch all of those videos and click all of those links. A note about the homework journals to receive full credit. Okay. Remember that in the creative writing journals, you need to provide critical feedback to somebody else who posted creative work. So it's not enough to just post your work. You have to respond to somebody else, which would be an 150-word response. In your reading journals, you need to have 350 words, and also your process journal has to have 350 words. If you don't, that will affect how many points you get. And just as a quick reminder, next week will be a mandatory workshop. If you don't show up, you will be in danger of not passing the class. So if you haven't done any of the journals, that's fine, but you have to show up to the workshop, which is when I get you into groups and you give each other feedback for the work you're working on before we turn in our portfolios. All right, that's week 4. Happy writing.